Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Scott Veritas here with my co-host Ben Rebellis, and today we're going to talk about Budweiser, and more specifically its parent company, the Anheuser-Busch company. You've probably drank Budweiser. You've probably drank Bud Light. You may or may not have seen an advertising campaign that they released recently with the charitable way of describing him is trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney. I would describe Dylan as a woman face minstrel show performer. Most of you watching the show are probably familiar with Dylan at this point, so I'm not going to actually go into who he is too much. Of course, depending on where you go, you may hear him referred to as a her, though, because Dylan is, basic description is transgender influencer, does these very sort of not so subtly provocative social media posts where he says, you know, it's day 100 as a girl, and he acts strangely juvenile. Like, I don't even want to say he acts feminine. He acts like a 13 or 14-year-old girl in most of his videos. Needless to say, he's probably the best possible person if you wanted to infuriate a vaguely right-wing audience. He would be the best person to do so. Anheuser-Busch and their line of Bud Light products have a demographic that aren't overtly conservative. It's not a political company. It's a beer company. But certainly the people who have drank most of the cheap beer in this country have been relatively masculine, run-of-the-mill men. It's been men. It's a fairly masculine demographic, a somewhat maybe vaguely conservative demographic. I don't really know a ton about who's drinking beer in this country. I don't drink a lot of beer myself. I don't drink a lot of alcohol, period. But all hell has broken loose because of Bud Light's decision to have Dylan Mulvaney as a mascot in one of their ads. The ad is basically Dylan Mulvaney dancing in a bathtub with some Bud Lights. There's been a massive backlash to this, more so than your typical go woke, go broke situation. I mean, we've had situations recently where certain Marvel movies, Star Wars movies aren't doing as well because of the wokeification of cinema. We sort of hear this go woke, go broke term, but usually companies are able to weather the storm. You don't really get a scalp if you're on the right. Generally, the right doesn't engage in effective forms of cancel culture particularly often. It's really a left-wing man's game. But Bud Light has lost something like $5 or $6 billion in revenue, apparently. And there are lots of videos coming out of people who own liquor stores in the South who say their overall sales are hurt because nobody's buying Anheuser-Busch products. People who are like sales representatives or like district managers for the company Anheuser-Busch have been saying that particularly in rural America, they're having a very hard time making sales. It looks like this has been at least a partially successful boycott. The boycott seems to have generally been led by Matt Walsh and folks over at the Daily Wire. But of course, it's a broad conservative boycott of Anheuser-Busch. The most recent update we have for the story, and it may continue to develop before we fully edit and release the show, is that Anheuser-Busch's CEO released a statement. You could call
there
it
are words.
A statement. They released some words about this controversy. There is one sentence in the entire statement of any substance, and it was a sentence in which the CEO says, "We do not mean to, engage in a conversation that divides people. We've always wanted to bring people together over a beer," which is a fairly innocuous and neutral statement, but sort of implies that there's a subtle understanding of the fact that having Dylan Mulvaney as your mascot, although he is not mentioned by name, is not the best move for a company that has an even vaguely conservative demographic audience. Now, of course, there is no actual apology in the statement. The rest of the statement is it's meaningless. I'm not even going to read any of it out to you on the show. It's just vague corporate gobbledygook that really doesn't cut to the point of what the actual boycott is about at all. There's that one sentence, like I said, of like, sorry if we kind of, got a little spicy there for you.
It wasn't even really an apology. It's like, oh, we shouldn't have gotten near this issue. Like, we touched the electric fence. It wasn't so much apologizing for getting shocked.
It was like, oh, I see we got a little divisive by putting like a woman face minstrel show in our advertising campaign. Putting the single most hated person like by the right in America. Like, you couldn't find a better person. You could put like Kamala Harris in an ad and it wouldn't have made such a big deal. So anyway, you get this statement, and now there's an interesting controversy over people saying like, you know what, the statement at the very least didn't contain all of the typical kind of leftist buzzwords. It wasn't like, it wasn't defensive of Dylan Mulvaney. I guess would be considered like a small victory for the right, is that the statement wasn't your typical, like, we will stand up against hate and continue to support LGBTQ representation in our advertisements. It didn't say anything like that. So it was lacking in some of that rhetoric. So some people have been saying that maybe people should lay off of Anheuser-Busch. Some very prominent people, by the way, Donald Trump Jr., Caitlyn Jenner, PSA Stitch, who's a great YouTuber. I recommend his content, even though I happen to disagree with him on this, because other people like Walsh, who's leading the boycott, Tim Pool and others, have said it's not an apology. We should continue the boycott. I'm firmly in that corner. But before I say anything else, I want to hand it over to Ben, because there's a lot to talk about here. I don't know how you feel about the boycott at this point. I firmly support. I think an apology is the bare minimum. It's like that's the only way you could even get close to getting us to end this boycott. And even then, it's like maybe we should just run you into the ground, make an example of you.
I think that anyone who's listened to the episodes we put out here knows how I'm going to start this, is that politics ruins everything. It really does. And one of these weeks, we may be able to touch upon a topic where I'm not irritated by everybody in this debate. But this week's not going to be that week, because I'm obviously irritated with Budweiser and the left. I'll put this really bluntly. I find Dylan Mulvaney super cringe. Like, the cringiest. I think he makes women look bad, and I'm not typically in the business of being offended for other identity groups for their own behalf, because most of the time when people do that, it's super disingenuous. But if I were a woman, this would annoy me. Like, it's also creepy. This is not an adult male becoming an adult female and living in the world as an adult female. It's an adult male trying to be a teenage girl and living out this fantasy that he thinks teenage girls would want. And there's something creepy about that. But I'm also kind of annoyed with the reaction to it. And I'll get to the boycott because I'm a little... But people, I think it was Kid Rock shooting cases of Bud Light with high-powered rifles, which he had to go out and buy some Bud. He might have had that lying around, but I'm guessing he had to pay Anheuser-Busch to get that. People just going unhinged about the caricature of a woman that Bud Light decided to have advertised for them. I don't think this is one of those examples we see of wokeness creeping into all of our institutions. This was a money grab. This was, we're going to try to expand into a market that we think we don't have, and we're going to use a person that is prominent in that community to try to penetrate that market. And someone in their marketing division is either too woke to realize why this was a bad idea, or genuinely thought it was a way to reach into this demographic that I guess probably prefer pink martinis over one of the shittiest beers out there. And side note, I am a bit of a beer snob. Bud Light is garbage. I'm enjoying a wonderful double hazy from Sweetwater just because I don't normally drink during the show, but we were going to talk about beer. I'm like, well, I'm going to have a good beer here. But to get to the boycotts, I like boycotts as a tactic, because most of the time that you and I disagree, Scott, it's because there's a problem out there and you are more approving. You're more approving of state intervention than I am, of passing laws and things like that. But boycotts are a wonderful market solution. It's people making an individual choice to not buy from somebody for their own individual reasons and doing it in a collective way. I'm a huge fan of boycotts. I think it's a great way to get a point across. Now, Anheuser-Busch, I believe, and I didn't look this up, so I might be wrong when I say this, but I think they're the number one beer creator, distributor,
in the US, yeah.
Producer. And they have a huge part of the world market as well. Yeah. So, maybe the boycott hits a bottom line. Maybe it scares them off of doing stuff like this. I don't know how effective it'll be in the end. But I'm a big fan of boycotts, and I totally support it in this case.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I want to touch on the Kid Rock thing, because I did see some of that. I have to say that optically, people like Kid Rock frustrate me, because I support this boycott. I appreciate if he's going to participate in it, but I don't think Kid Rock understands that he hasn't been cool since 2003. Right? Kid Rock has not, if it was 2003, that would have been a really effective strategy for the right, is let's get Kid Rock and Ted Nugent to
Right.
to talk about it. You know, like these people who are like some of the very small number of conservative celebrities that exist, of which there are very few. But like, yeah, if like Tim Allen and you know, I don't know if he's done anything on this, but if you have like Tim Allen and Kid Rock in 2023, you know, speaking out against something,
Yeah.
it is actually bad for the boycott. It really looks very silly. You have an aging rock star and an actor who, you know, has never been particularly relevant, at least not since he played, you know, Buzz Lightyear or whatever. It's like these conservative celebrities who jump on this stuff. Kid Rock's probably the best example. I think he really, really encapsulates like the aging conservative celebrity who always like uses 2015 anti-woke rhetoric, says like, yo, political correctness is bad. It's like, we don't call it political correctness anymore. We've stopped calling it that, started calling it wokeness. Right. You're kind of stuck in 2015. I remember Bill Burr, who's a very funny guy, but he did a comedy special like 4 or 5 years ago where it was very like, everyone's always getting offended. And it's like, yeah, that was 2015. That was like early, like Dave Rubin days of like regressive left and freedom of speech. Like people are just, Kid Rock just really, you mentioned cringeworthiness with Dylan Mulvaney. Kid Rock is cringe. And I don't like when someone like him is who's being leaned on to push these boycotts and these conservatives. I think somebody like Walsh, who's actually a political actor, Matt Walsh, who's just a lot smarter and a lot more relevant. Granted, he's not a celebrity. He's kind of a pseudo celebrity, but he's not a celebrity. But I trust him a lot more to optically handle these sort of things. Kid Rock is just, it's very frustrating when he gets involved in any of this stuff. He had a video maybe like a year ago where it was like an anti-cancel culture music video that he made where he was like, fuck you, liberal millennial white snowflake. And it's just like, it's just, again, it's like, yeah, I mean, you kind of could do this in 2015 and I might have given you a little bit of a round of applause for it. But now it's like the rhetoric has moved on. This guy is completely out of touch with what the situation actually is. And it does come off as kind of cringe. So
there's
I wish
another problem with it. And actually why I get really irritated by it is it makes Dylan Mulvaney look reasonable.
It makes him look cool, right? Because it's like Kid Rock is much more cringe in a way than even, I will admit, Kid Rock as your mascot is almost more cringe than Dylan Mulvaney as your mascot.
I mean, you can say what you want about the act that Dylan puts on, but I actually saw some written comments she put out about after this boycott, and they were nothing but radiating positivity. That, you know, that's kind of the brand Dylan's developed, is being super positive and joyful and enthusiastic. So you've got the Kid Rock right saying that Dylan Mulvaney is heralding in Armageddon. And on the other hand, he's just saying, I'm glad I'm in my body, and no matter what people say, I'm happy with myself, and I want everybody else to be happy with them too. Between those two positions, I think Dylan Mulvaney's the more reasonable one, which drives me crazy that the other side is the side that I would typically be behind when it comes to this type of culture war fight, is making the faux woman caricature look like the reasonable one in this debate.
And optically, it's brilliant. Dylan Mulvaney, for all of his nonsense, he does some really interesting things optically. There are videos where people will do caricatures of, it's funny because he himself is a caricature, but people will do characters of Dylan where it's like a very hairy, run-of-the-mill cisgender, I'll use again for lack of a better term. I don't know how else to talk about it, but a cisgender man, like bouncing up and down and being like day 200 as a girl. And they're not particularly funny. I mean, it's a little funny to be like, yeah, okay, they're making fun of how this guy's like clearly a man or whatever. They're not particularly funny videos. And he'll respond to them on TikTok by saying like, hey, I don't know what your name is, but I would love to talk with you and have you understand how, what it's like to be a transgender woman. And you can actually sense, if you're good at picking up on these things, the seething rage in Dylan's voice. Like Dylan is clearly annoyed by that stuff, but he's very good at hiding it for the most part and kind of putting on this positive face and making it out like he's the nice guy, the nice girl, whatever. And it's a great strategy. It's essentially like a kill him with kindness kind of optical strategy that always makes you come off as the victim, as just sort of the innocent person going about your business. When in reality, what Dylan is doing is subtly extremely provocative and extremely bad for society. And it's not hard to see why, if you are somebody who picks up on subtle things that harm society writ large. We've talked about it on the show. Subtle things like the fact that he always refers to himself as a girl and not as a woman. If you're picking up on stuff like that, you start to realize that something very strange is going on. And actually, I guess in a way, it's not that subtle, because the performance he engages in as a woman are really bizarre. And the fact that he has a very kind of boyish frame, and he's prancing around in these bikinis despite the fact that like he has no breasts to fill out a bikini. It's just a very odd thing to look at. And
well, Nike thought he needed a sports bra.
Yeah, it's all very disturbing, and yet he is better than somebody like a Kid Rock at just sort of playing the nice guy, which, you know, is not what I would always necessarily encourage the right to do. I think sometimes it can go too far, where like somebody like Donald Trump never shows any empathy for anyone, and I don't think that's the best strategy. But I do understand the sort of no more Mr. Nice Guy attitude. But to get back to the boycott itself more broadly, so there are aspects of it, obviously, that are not going to be that effective. I highly doubt that the Kid Rock thing was convincing anyway. I mean, you know what? Maybe Kid Rock has a group of like 39-year-old guys who really used to love his music, who drink Bud Light, and maybe they won't drink Bud Light because they saw this Kid Rock. I don't know. Like, but in any case, putting him aside for a second, I do think that the boycott, you know, I'm glad that you're supportive of it, and I think that it's very important because it has been damaging this brand. And as Matt Walsh has pointed out on his show, it's important for the right, and you might disagree with me on this, but I definitely think it's important for the right to try and get scalps in the culture war. And I'll explain why, because it's nasty language. I know it is, to talk about getting scalps and making examples of people. It's not something I wish we had to do, but here's why I think we have to do it. And it's because the culture war is, I think, one of the most misunderstood things about the culture war is that it's largely about incentives. Institutions that you want to control, you can control them largely through incentives. And the left has done a very good job of saying, if you cross us even slightly, even if you don't cross us, even if you don't clap loudly enough for Dear Leader, you haven't crossed us. But even if you just don't clap loudly enough for us, we will fucking destroy you. Like, the left goes nuts on any company, any artist, any entertainment media that doesn't clap loudly enough for Dear Leader and approve of them strongly enough and approve of their sacred cow strongly enough. And they create a culture in which all of these money-minded, as you were saying, Ben, executives are like, we're doing what the woke people want because they are the ones holding the pitchforks. If the right does not learn to go tit for tat in that, because they're afraid of creating a sort of cancel culture arms race, which I understand there's a legitimate fear, but if they're too afraid of it and they don't engage in a tit for tat, they're just going to let woke people continue to control these institutions and these corporations. If the right even gets in, let's say it's a boxing match and we're just getting the shit kicked out of us. If we get even one good haymaker in, then, you get one company and you say, you guys lost a bunch of money because you crossed us. We're going to run you into the fucking ground because you crossed us. You're a company that's actually, that answers to conservatives. Anheuser-Busch seems to answer to conservatives to some extent, unlike a lot of major institutions. And to say, we're going to make an example of you, it would send a signal and an incentive to other companies that says, hey, there are things you can do that will go too far on the left, not just on the right. And I think that's very important if you're going to engage in effective, culture war combat, if you will, is to make sure that these institutions also have a healthy fear of going too far to the left, which they had not that long ago. It's a generally understood fact that Colin Kaepernick probably would still be in the NFL if he had not kneeled. He wasn't. By the time he retired, he wasn't the best quarterback in the world, but the guy went to a Super Bowl, very talented quarterback, would never deny that in a million years. He brought the 49ers to the Super Bowl, won a few playoff games, clearly a very talented quarterback. The fact that he became a sort of mediocre quarterback, but still probably good enough to be in the NFL, and also was creating a nationwide controversy by kneeling for the national anthem, meant that at the time, there was an example of someone more or less being canceled from the right. In a way, it's actually a legitimate thing that I've heard brought up about Kaepernick was that he was almost sort of canceled from the right. If he had still been as good of a quarterback in 2016 as he was in 2012, I do think he would have actually managed to eke it out. But that's kind of neither here nor there. It's not a football podcast. but talented guy, talented quarterback. Would never deny that. But anyway, I put a lot out there, Ben. But
yeah. So there's a few things. First of all, the way I want this all to eventually play out is beer companies and clothing companies and whatever to stop being in the politics game. Just go back to making commercials with Michael Jordan dumping the basketball while wearing Nikes, of some frogs saying Budweiser during Super Bowl commercials. That's what I want. I don't need to know, because I am not indulging the fantasy that these companies care about anything other than profit motive. I can't believe anyone else thinks that. Do you really think that Chase Bank gives a single fuck about trans people? Of course they don't. So I that's what I want to see. And I guess one of my questions to you, Scott, is do you think that these type of campaigns on the behalf of huge corporations like Anheuser-Busch are the result of capture, or are they the result of profit incentives?
That is such a great question, because I've never been entirely sure what the answer is, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. I think it's
and just a little
question.
Context, because I think I saw an article and I didn't have time to read it today, but there were at least some higher level executives at Budweiser that didn't know this was happening. So this could have been a campaign pushed by a lesser that didn't get the right approvals or whatever. So yeah, it's the capture versus profit incentive question is interesting. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. It's a really good question. It's one that people talk about a lot. Is wokeness actually able to make companies act against their own interest? And I think we're seeing some evidence that it can. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is there was an announcement recently that the Star Wars film franchise will be revived after, I don't think a Star Wars film has come out since like 2019. There hasn't been a Star Wars movie in a few years. And the plan for a while for Disney was to be releasing a Star Wars movie every year by going, episodic and then switching every off year to a spin-off like Solo, a Star Wars story, or Rogue One. Solo, I think was the first Star Wars movie released after The Last Jedi, and it, as a result, did not do very well at the box office. It actually contained less culture war toxic garbage than The Last Jedi did, but because it had the stink of The Last Jedi on it, it was very financially unsuccessful for a Disney product, for a Star Wars film. It still made a decent amount of money, but it didn't recoup its full marketing costs, I think, which is very unusual for a Star Wars product. I mean, those are obviously movies that make oodles and oodles of money. The Force Awakens is still, I think, like the highest grossing film domestically of all time, because it was building off of decades of anticipation for a new Star Wars film. Right. I bring this up because there's been an announcement that they are finally going to start making more Star Wars films. And there were also grumblings about, there's always been rumors that Kathleen Kennedy, who's been the showrunner of Star Wars ever since the new trilogy, would get fired, in part because of the very sort of like feminist woke influence of the new Star Wars products. That has never actually materialized, even though it's been rumored multiple times. She is still the showrunner, the executive producer of the franchise. And there have always been rumors that Star Wars has seen what is happening to their products. The Mandalorian, the ratings have plummeted because now it's like a show that features the great actors like Lizzo. Yeah, I don't know if anyone saw that clip, but like Lizzo, who's basically just sort of like one of the liberals' favorite like pet representations of black people, of like, look at this kind of obese black woman who's so fun. And everybody knows the role that kind of Lizzo kind of plays for liberals at this point. She was featured in The Mandalorian for unknown reasons. I could speculate, but I guess it kind of has to do with the thing I said before that. But in any case,
Stacey Abrams in some.
Stacey Abrams was in Star Trek, I think. Okay, it's just stuff like that, So anyway, Star Wars is one of many franchises that has gone woke in many ways. Kenobi was a horrible. Oh my God. Kenobi was a fucking disaster, and it had a lot to do with wokeness. I won't get into it. It's not, we don't just talk about Star Wars all day on this channel. Although we might get more views if we did. Apparently, if you do anything with Star Wars, you get like 1 million views. That's what I've heard. But
find a way to get it in the title.
And I say this all by the way, as somebody who really loved Star Wars before it was fucking destroyed by Disney. So I do have a personal stake in this. They announced that they're making these new movies, and everyone's like, oh, what are the new movies going to be about? At least one of them brings back one of the most overtly woke things about the most recent Star Wars trilogy, which is the character Rey, who is just sort of this empowered female character, can do no wrong, Mary Sue, obvious stand-in for Kathleen Kennedy and her sort of feminist woke ideology, a character that was just loathed. One of the main reasons why people got progressively less interested in the most recent Star Wars products was because of Rey and characters like Rey and Moses Ingram's character from Kenobi and these other empowered female characters that just are all the same and get so tiresome. The fact that they're making another Star Wars movie starring Daisy Ridley as Rey is a sign that, because by the way, I'm going to make a prediction. The Star Wars movie that comes out, we've seen that the ratings for The Mandalorian, a once very, very popular show on Disney Plus, have plummeted. The ratings for Andor, which is actually a pretty decent Star Wars product, were bad. The ratings for Book of Boba Fett were terrible. A lot of Star Wars products are just not doing well anymore, which is crazy because Star Wars has always done very well at the box office. Even when they're not all that well received, like the prequels, those still made a lot of money. And so I think that because I have not watched The Mandalorian season 3. I didn't watch the Book of Boba Fett. I regrettably watched Kenobi, but I wish I didn't. Not a lot of people are watching Andor. And the funny thing is I did because I saw that it was actually supposed to be pretty good, and it was. And I think the next Star Wars movie is going to like flop. Like Solo, a Star Wars story, is the closest thing to a flop that's ever been had for the Star Wars franchise, but it didn't quite bomb at the box office. It just like about broke even. I think the next Star Wars movie might like bomb. Like no of actual fans of Star Wars are going to go see this movie. And all of this is to say, back to your point, Ben, the question you asked me is, do I think that wokeness can actually get corporate profit-driven companies to act against their own interests? It looks like they can. I think because the woman, by the way, and there's an interview with the woman who decided, the marketing exec who worked on this campaign with Dylan Mulvaney at Anheuser-Busch, she was talking about, how excited she was about this campaign and how it was to like bring the company away from this kind of fratty culture. And it's like, she should have known better. Like she's not like a blue-haired screeching SJW. Mm-hmm. You can tell she's kind of a stuffy marketing exec who wanted to make more money for her company. But I think it does get some crossed wires. Like the fact that they are making another Star Wars movie with Rey, I'm sorry, I just can't get over. That movie's going to bomb. Just like The Mandalorian season 3 has bombed. Like some interesting things are going to start happening where we do see, I think, an effective boycotts of some of these products where companies might start to realize like, hey, this isn't good for our bottom line. But I guess to answer your question again, they should have already realized that. The Star Wars thing in particular, I bring up that example, not just because I like Star Wars, but because I think it's a really great example of us seeing people just kind of bulldoze through the obvious reality that, you go woke, you go broke, at least if it's Star Wars.
Yeah, I think that Hollywood actually, at least, this may be confined to Hollywood, but Hollywood makes me believe that a lot of this is capture instead of trying to go after some demographic or trying to, instead of a profit motive. Because any person who has seen all of these Star Wars, and I haven't seen since Disney took over, I just stopped. But in every other regard where the wokeism has infected things, if you took any normal human being and said, hey, can you look at our products and see why they're not selling as well? I think any normal human being would go, because you started getting into politics in a weird way. And so it just has to be that they're so blinded or captured, because anyone that's actually seeking profits wouldn't have done this to their brands. They just wouldn't. And Hollywood is such a good example of it, because these movies keep coming out and nobody's watching them. Now, I know there's a whole dynamic that's changed in the movie industry with Netflix and Amazon making their own stuff. There's certainly the proliferation of media, I'm sure, is a big part of this, and I'm uneducated in this sense. But it just seems to me anybody could watch any of these shows and go, oh, do you want to know why you're losing fans? It's because they don't want to be part of the culture war when they're watching people with lightsabers fight.
Yeah. And it used to be generally very well understood, especially by stuffy, marketing types. Like it used to be, you would not see political advertisement, politics in advertisements. You would see it. There are some examples you can find from like the pre-social media era. You would see very little of it prior to like 2014. 2014, it really started to pick up with like the feminism, Maybe like 2013-ish, like 2013, 14, some subtle like feminist messaging started to pop up, and then things have only gotten crazier from there with the trans stuff and the Black Lives Matter stuff. It used to be considered like the third rail of advertising. Like, don't alienate half your audience, right? Michael Jordan famously said, Republicans buy sneakers too. And he's right. They do. And one of the things I like about this boycott is it's time for Republicans to remind companies that, yes, we buy sneakers too. Yes, we buy beer too. Yes, we watch Star Wars too. And we won't when it becomes abundantly clear to us that you're going to subject us to this kind of propaganda if we engage with your products.
Or even like, what now would it be to drink a Bud Light? Like, to have a bottle of Bud Light. Now it's sending a message. Maybe let's say that I lost my taste buds and I liked Bud Light. Now, if I'm drinking Bud Light, let's say it's some kind of, maybe smaller dive bar in a rural area of a southern state. Now I'm sending a message when I don't want to send a message. I just want to drink this beer. And you've now weaponized your product. So even some people who may like your product may think twice before buying it.
Yeah. And that's what, you're right. That is what people want. Like, when I watch Star Wars, I don't want it to be based. I might enjoy it if there was some subtle political messaging that I kind of jived with, and it was very subtle. Because sure, everyone knows A New Hope is like an allegory for Vietnam or whatever. Like, there's always subtle political messaging in Star Wars, in movies. Sure. That's fine. That's part of art. Because people always say that, like, oh, you're saying you can't have politics in art. No, of course you can, as long as there's a certain amount of subtlety and it actually works well. As long as it doesn't prevent the product from being entertaining and meaningful for the audience and enjoyable to the audience. Right. But
you can always tell when you're listening to Christian rock, even if you don't hear the lyrics, right? Yes. You can always tell when you're being messaged to just based on the quality. Yes,
exactly. And that's the thing is, people do just want to have a beer. They do just want to watch Star Wars. They just want to play video games. Like, right. They just want to engage with these products in a way. And by the way, they're entitled to that. You know why? Because that's the way this worked for like hundreds of years, for as long as like modern Western capitalism existed. There wasn't a lot of political messaging mixed in with corporate advertising. That you might find a couple of very vague examples, but there was almost nothing until around 2014. Mm-hmm. And if companies would just return to that, what Red America is asking for is not to have maybe some of their values being reflected, some of the basic stuff about like, faith, family, blah, yada, yada. And that used to be in some advertising, but you don't have to be like, this beer is in support of guns and this
MAGA Light is not going to be a good beer.
Or like Black Rifle Coffee. Yeah, like you don't need to be, it doesn't need to be MAGA Light. Yeah, it doesn't need to be like, this beer is the official beer of Donald Trump. The Daily Wire is an interesting, and Matt Walsh has been leading this boycott against Anheuser-Busch. The Daily Wire does something kind of interesting. We should probably talk about it because they've been doing it lately. They do this thing where they release products, whether it's like a razor because Gillette kind of went woke, or there was a chocolate bar because I think it was Hershey, kind of went woke and had like a transgender advertising campaign. They release these products where they say like, this is the conservative chocolate bar, and people will make fun of, they do. But the thing is, I don't know how much money they make from selling their conservative chocolate bars or their conservative razors. Jeremy Boring is the Daily Wire personality that they use to represent these products. They always do this, and I think it's more of a marketing campaign for the Daily Wire as a publication. I don't think they've ever intended to have people buy the chocolate bars or the razors, because people criticize often the right for like the backlash. And one of the things that gets made fun of is these Daily Wire, like conservative branded products. I think there's a huge misunderstanding. The way that Jeremy and the Daily Wire, Jeremy Boring and the Daily Wire have advertised those products has always been a little tongue in cheek to me. I've always felt like my understanding is I'm not supposed to actually buy this. Like I see the ad and it makes me laugh and it makes me maybe want to watch the Matt Walsh show because I remember that the Daily Wire exists. I don't think people are being fair to the Daily Wire when they say like, well, they're just doing the same thing. They're creating an arms race around, well, now we have a conservative chocolate bar. And it's like, I don't think that's really, I think it's a huge misread of what they're doing.
And I'm still not indulging that the Daily Wire or Jeremy Boring or who with Jeremy's Razors really care. Like, obviously they do care because they're political commentators and that's what spurned all of this. But at the end of the day, Jeremy Boring cares about Daily Wire making money.
Yeah.
And this is what they do here. I'm not calling the people at the Daily Wire disingenuous. I think that they have firmly held values that they want to put out there. But we all know at the end of the day, if Jeremy Boring was losing a lot of money on Jeremy's Razors, he would stop putting out Jeremy's Razors.
Yeah. That's the thing, is we just want so much of what we talk about of the show gets me pining for the days of like 2012, of just not that long ago when these things weren't a problem. But speaking of the past and the future, there's another story I wanted to talk about on today's show that has to do with a young man, a man who's actually fairly close to me in age. His name is Justin Pearson. And there are videos of Justin Pearson.
I'm already laughing.
This is a great story.
Hilarious.
This is a fucking crazy story that is a little old, admittedly old at this point. By the time the show comes out, it'll have been about a week and a half since this surfaced, but we had to talk about it. And it's about the past and the future of one Justin Pearson. Justin Pearson is somebody you've probably seen if you've been paying attention to politics in the last 2 weeks. He's one of the Tennessee state representatives who got expelled from the Tennessee State House because he led a protest / riot / insurrection, whatever you want to call it, depending on your views, in the state capitol after the school shooting that happened in Nashville. And his protest / riot / insurrection, again, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to call it a riot because it seemed fairly unruly. I don't know. Maybe I'll correct that later. But this riot was over gun control. He was saying, like, guns are the problems. Let's pass gun control legislation. Nothing too crazy, except that it was very disruptive on the floor of the House. It broke decorum. He was using a megaphone in the House. He led all these people into the House to, generally fuck with the legislators and the structure of the state House of Representatives. There are videos of police barely able to contain a crowd that is pushing their way in. It does kind of resemble the January 6th, quote unquote insurrection in many ways. And so there were consequences for he and two of his peers who had helped lead this protest / riot. He was expelled along with one of the other state representatives. One of them was not expelled, and a lot of people...
By one vote.
A lot of people brought up the fact that, yes, the two younger black men who got expelled are these young black men, and the one person who was not expelled is an older white woman. Another thing that gets left out of that conversation is that the older white woman also more or less apologized for her actions, and also actually brought legal counsel to the impeachment proceedings for herself and defended what she had done. Whereas Pearson, and I think the other guy's name is Justin Jones, they did not really put up any kind of defense during their impeachment hearings. They simply doubled down. And so, yes, that this older white woman was able to survive impeachment by one vote, whereas they were not, but it was not because she is a white woman, which is what, of course, is what they're going with. Which, by the way, that woman is hilarious for basically apologizing for what she did and then going on to say, well, obviously, just because I'm a white lady, I got to... That was so fucking duplicitous of her. I was like, this story is so full of just shamelessness. Yeah. Because we haven't even gotten to the story yet.
No.
This is a fucking crazy story. We haven't even gotten to the craziest part. But yeah, that woman, I saw the clip of her being like, obviously I made it through because I'm a white woman and they expelled my colleagues for being these young black boys. And I was like, bitch, you apologized. You said that what you did was wrong. You brought legal counsel to defend yourself. Like, and then now you're saying that you got there. What a fucking, they should have expelled her, that ungrateful bitch. That was so fucking shameless of her. I'm sorry, but I try not to just chimp out on the show, but that drove me up a wall. And then to get to the actual story, we're not even at the story yet.
Yeah.
So one of these guys that got expelled, one of the younger black guys, I think he's in his late 20s, Justin Pearson. Mm-hmm. You see these videos of him where MSNBC and CNN are running in to do, K fabrication for this sort of like civil rights cosplay, I think is like the best way to describe it. Of course, he's got, big afro, Malcolm X glasses. And I'm gonna
weird clothes.
Yeah, everything just reeks of cosplay, of 1960s civil rights preacher cosplay. And I met people like this in college. I actually knew a guy in college that was a lot like this, that I would clash with from time to time when I was in the College Democrats. You meet guys like this who are like, they're younger black men who exist in the 20-teens or the 2020s who are acting like it's the 1960s and put on their Malcolm X glasses and talk in weird ways. But only so often will someone get caught in the act of it as brutally as this Justin Pearson character did. Because there are videos now of him, of course, giving these speeches where he's like, I have good news, brothers. And I'm not exaggerating. I know you're going to be
so
like,
glad you're the one that did that because I didn't want to have to.
I don't really want to have to do it either because I know how it sounds. You're like, that guy, he does not talk like that. That is no, I'm doing probably a better impression of MLK than Justin Pearson does, because he does this MLK impression where he's like, I have good news, brothers. The NRA was going to win the day. And now I'm not kidding.
Way more
I will
link crazy.
I will link the video to him speaking this way in the description of this video so that people can see I'm not just doing a caricature of this young black guy. I promise I'm not. That is actually how he's been giving these speeches. Now, that in and of itself would be funny enough because you can kind of tell listening to him, like, that's not how that guy talks. Right. You just know listening to it. It's not a very good impression of MLK. His is probably worse than mine. I brought it up to like an 8. He really brings it to a 10. Like, I tried to contain myself and just give you guys an idea of what this guy sounds like when he's giving these speeches because of this gun control protest. There is another video of Justin Pearson from the year 2016 when he was a college student and he is running for student government. And he sounds like this. He sounds like, hello, everyone. My name is Justin Pearson, and I am running for student body president. He sounds like me. He sounds like us. He just sounds like a normal fucking person who exists in the year, at the time it would have been 2016. And he doesn't sound like a black preacher marching with Martin Luther King in 1963. Like it is. And so anyway, what you find out by watching there are these videos now where they've compiled him speaking in 2016 completely, for lack of a better word, normally, like with just sort of a normal, run of the mill cadence, no real affectation of any kind of radio announcer voice thing going on. But the way that I've always figured more or less how I talk, I don't really have much of a detectable accent, what you would call radio announcer voice. Justin Pearson spoke this way not terribly long ago. I hypothetically, you could pick up like a Southern Tennessee accent or whatever, or I think MLK might have been. Was he from Alabama? I forget where he's from. But hypothetically, you could pick up like a Southern black accent, I guess, over the course of several decades, maybe. But man, in 6 or 7 years, to try and portray yourself as sounding the way that this guy sounds compared to how he sounded before. And we'll link the videos in the description again of him talking in 2016 versus him talking in 2023. And it's jarring. It is like something out of the Twilight Zone. It is crazy. And I wanted to talk about it on the show, not just because it's funny. And it is very funny. And it is absolutely hilarious because it's like something out of like a Chris Rock movie. Like, it's just a weird thing to see somebody do, and to see someone get caught in the act completely red-handed. You know that the guy definitely like his natural affectation is the way he talked in 2016. It is not the way he talks now. The thing that is so interesting about it to me is that I think it's emblematic of the grifting that we so often see on the left. The best example I would give is Hassan Piker. Hassan Piker is somebody who cosplays as a lower middle class, edgy socialist, streamer, when in reality, he's a rich guy. He's a rich guy. He is a guy who has nice cars and lives in a, big house in Los Angeles, and who, is kind of just generally a fuckboy, frat boy, which was a very kind of Republican demographic really until the last 5 years. And he just sort of wears shirts that say like racism bad, eat the rich. And, but at the same time, he wears like designer sunglasses. Hassan Piker's hilarious because, again, he's not good at being a con man. I guess he is actually, because he makes so much fucking money, but he's just not good at conning me. Like, I see videos of him with a shirt that says eat the rich in designer sunglasses and designer jeans. And I'm like, do people, I'm going to ask you a question, Ben, because I know I've been ranting and raving here for a while.
No, you're good.
And so I will throw it to you by asking you, why are people falling for this shit? It's so obvious. You can see, you can catch these people red-handed, and people will still be like, "Yeah, Hassan Piker is my like socialist hero, and Justin Pearson is a modern-day Martin Luther King Jr." They'll fawn over him. MSNBC is fawning over him for and setting up K fabrication for him to make him look like the new MLK.
Yeah, I'll give the viewers, listeners some insight on how I prepare for this show. You usually compile a list of what we're going to talk about. Typically has links to videos or tweets or whatever. So I open up a new Evernote page and I give it a clever title at the top of it, and then I just kind of write notes as I go through the links that you send me. And so I will let you know that after you sent me one of the links, these are the 4 words that I wrote in my notebook. Is this fucking real? I couldn't believe it was real. This is the worst Jesse Jackson impression I could possibly make. You know what Justin Pearson is? Justin Pearson is the girl who goes to England abroad over a summer and then comes back with an accent. Like, is there anything nearing authenticity in this person? Your question to me is, who is convinced by this act? I wrote down the exact same thing. And a theory that I have is I think people have kind of turned off their scam detector for a couple of reasons. First, we are overwhelmed by people trying to manipulate us and trick us these days. I mean, whether it be the Nigerian scammers trying to get you to send credit card numbers, whether that be phishing emails, or whether it be hack fraudsters like this, we're just overwhelmed and burned out on having to detect every single fucking lie that's told to us to try to get our vote or our money or our identity, our social security, whatever. I think that's one natural thing that's just kind of happened with the proliferation of everybody knowing everything these days. But second, I think that people are okay with the cosplay, with this disingenuousness when it's done to further the cause of justice. I mean, we've seen people say that silence is violence, but rioting in multiple cities in the United States and causing billions of dollars of damage is not violence, and it's okay. We saw medical doctors and epidemiologists who said that racism was the real disease, while just months earlier they had spoken out about the health risks of people who are protesting COVID lockdowns. In the name of justice, people are willing to put up with anything. And we've seen the hypocrisy just so many times. Imagine if Tim Scott or some other black Republican put on this black scent to talk about why abortion is awful. Can you imagine how much the internet would be blown up? So my theory is that people just bypass this because you kept using the verb caught. I don't think anybody on the left thinks that they caught him. I think they're just okay with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think they probably see themselves reflected in it because so many people have like put on an act. Like, man, you really saw it during the George Floyd riots in 2020. So many fucking white girls that you went to college with, you have them still on Instagram or whatever. They're all posting these black squares, or they do what I like to call the serious face post, which is where there's like a picture of them with like their arms crossed with like a very serious face, or no, with one fist raised, right? So like one fist raised, very serious face, like, kind of smoldering at the camera. Like, and there's 3 paragraphs as a caption on Instagram of just like generic Black Lives Matter rhetoric, right? Of just like, I, as a white person, want to use my privilege to do better and educate, and support black body. And there's always the same fucking stupid look on their face with the fist raised in the air. And that is a cosplay of a sort. It's them saying like, I'm a part of this fist raised, rebellion against white supremacist patriarchy. It's a cosplay pretending to be a rebel when in reality, you're a part of the evil empire, because the evil empire is the woke orthodoxy. Like this George Floyd riots were state-sanctioned violence by mayors and district attorneys all across the nation who supported them both implicitly and at times explicitly. And what we see is that people, because one of the most important things to the woke orthodoxy is a victimhood complex, even as they have the mainstream media running K-fabrication for them and running interference for them, they still have to put on a show that they're the rebels, that they're the disempowered, that they're the oppressed. And people who fall for it, frankly, they're all game for it. They're like, yeah, let's all just kind of pretend Like, and maybe some of them do genuinely believe it, but honestly, in my opinion, I would consider that rising to the level of mental illness at this point. If you are a leftist who thinks you're losing, who thinks that you're disempowered, you are mentally ill. You have left this earth and are not in touch with reality. Like you have a almost schizophrenic relationship with the culture war if you are on the left and feel like you're losing and like you're the oppressed and the disenfranchised. It is hilarious to have your values reflected by Budweiser and all these other companies, by every corporation, by every media outlet, by every single Democratic politician in the country, by most district attorneys if you live in a city, by like every big tech company except Twitter at this point, nominally. And to be like, yeah, but we really are the rebels, though. We got to blow up the Death Star, guys. Like, it's like, no, you're the fucking Death Star. Like,
right. Do you think the left will eventually this will be seen as a strategic error, elevating people like this that are so easily exposed as frauds? Like, I just made the opposite point. I made the point that I think they don't care, that they're willing to put out whatever caricature in the cause of justice. But I do wonder if 5 years from now, 10 years, we look back and we go, oh, they were making such a mistake by elevating people like this.
I think that it won't be. I think you're right that people who are on the woke left will never hold people to account for getting caught in these sort of acts, unless it literally rises to the level of like a Rachel Dolezal. Like, it has to be something really, really blatant, and that just doesn't work for their philosophy. They won't, but it could end up hurting them with swing voters in situations where there's, let's say, an election where they're not just accountable to Democratic voters. So, for instance, I was thinking Justin Pearson, by the way, he and his colleague, Justin Jones, they've been reinstated to the state house because the state house got to expel them, but then the Nashville City Council was able to reinstate them because that's who votes to reinstate.
Right.
To be very specific, just so that people have the exact details, they were reappointed to their seats. The Nashville City Council got to vote on an appointment for the vacancy, and they reappointed both Jones and Pearson.
And then they do, and you may have read in this where they have to face a special election to basically
yes, they will face
back.
a special election to maintain their seats. But all of this is to say, I was thinking like, oh, it looks like their career in state politics and in their districts has probably been elevated by this, and they were able to win the day if their goal is to be a very popular state representative, a backbencher in the Democratic caucus of the Tennessee State House of Representatives.
Where there's a Republican supermajority.
Yes, where there's a Republican supermajority. So if that's what they want to do, and they want to do MSNBC interviews and just sort of have this cushy job where they don't pass a lot of legislation and they give a lot of speeches with baffling accents, they did a great job of elevating themselves in that world of backbencher state Democratic politics in Republican majority states. Now, if Justin Pearson ever had any ambitions of being, say, the governor of Tennessee, he absolutely fucked himself, because this video exists that Republican voters will find it equally hilarious to what Ben and I found it to be, and swing voters will find it disturbing and will not vote for somebody. So if he ever had any intention of like running for Congress in a purple district in Tennessee, maybe if there is like an overwhelmingly Democratic district, I guess maybe, but I think it would hurt him in a situation where the audience isn't as receptive to this kind of con man game. The same way that Dylan Mulvaney is incredibly off-putting to anyone that's not in that sort of core left-wing demographic. So, you know, that is the one silver lining to this, I think, is we will hear from Justin Pearson the same way we hear from Stacey Abrams. He will be one of these backbencher state level politicians, or Nina Turner is another one that always gets so much fucking attention. Like, they're so important, even though they're like state senators. They never even get elected to a significant office. Yeah. I think somebody who would be a great case study to see how far you can get being somebody who is pretty easy to catch in the act of something akin to a con is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's a video of her, and and she has this very blue district in New York where Nancy Pelosi herself famously said, you put a D next to a glass of water on the ballot and they'll win. So that's a direct quote from Nancy Pelosi about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's district. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is somebody who, of course, she's always going to win re-election in that district. But although one of her colleagues, Ilhan Omar, did almost lose her seat, that was kind of interesting. But in any case, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were to run for even statewide office in New York, a state that Lee Zeldin was nearly able to win, a state that as a state is not nearly as liberal as her district, she's always kind of come off to me as like a really good grifter within a certain demographic. Like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a 10 out of 10 like Hassan Piker level. Like she and Hassan Piker are like the best woke grifters. They're really good at getting woke people to give them money and power. More so power for AOC and more so money for Hassan, right? But there's kind of a limit, right? There's kind of a ceiling for AOC because if she like ran for president, certainly she would get less than 1% of the vote. Like it just, she would not do well. And I also will point out that she had a thing to compare her more one-to-one with Pearson. There was something it was like 3 or 4 years ago where she was giving a speech. It wasn't as blatant as Justin Pearson. And she's not black, so it would have been worse if it were as blatant. But I remember her getting this like weird Southern drawl that people were pointing out seemed kind of disingenuous during one of her speeches, where she was like, "Y'all don't know how it feels to like just." It wasn't quite as intense as Justin Pearson's like comedy impression of MLK. But do you remember that?
I've seen her play up the Latina. I've heard that go on.
Yeah, but she is Latina, and so she gets a certain. Although I guess if there's tons of video of her speaking, so
right,
if she takes it far enough, people will know it's not her natural affectation. But I do wish there was a way to hold these people to account for just a hilarious level of grift. Hassan Piker, by the way, is like one of them, is a major target that if anybody has any dirt on him, that motherfucker, that guy is such a disingenuous shitbag. There are very few people I just straight up probably wouldn't have on this show if they were interested in coming on. I don't know if I'd have Hassan. I just view him as like grifter extraordinaire, completely disingenuous, astroturfed piece of shit.
Good. That'll get us some clicks. I like that. So you mentioned the term like holding these people to account, and we actually had a really good, and I'll recommend to everybody our discussion kind of near the end of the show last show we put out about accountability culture. I thought we had a good discussion about that, so people should go back and listen to that. But what happened in this case is they were, quote, held accountable by the Republicans ousting them in a situation they most certainly would have come back from, which is exactly what's happened. Did you think that was a good thing for the Republicans in Tennessee to do to actually get rid of them? I personally think it gave them way more attention than they deserved. And when you have a super majority in the legislature like the Republicans do, why don't you just ignore the people that you don't have to listen to?
Yeah, it's I think sort of got outplayed or outmaneuvered. I understand why they expelled them because it was like they wanted to hold them to account for their behavior. But if they had been thinking just a couple of steps ahead, they would have realized that, okay, so if the Nashville City Council is able to make an appointment, to refill the seat, the Nashville City Council, I think, is entirely composed of Democrats, then, they would have seen how things would have played out. It's important for, I think, Republicans in situations like that to be thinking a few steps ahead. I have a little bit of sympathy for them because they wanted there to be a consequence for what Jones and Pearson and this other woman had done. But yeah, it definitely, look, they ended up going on Good Morning America. And in a sane world, that wouldn't have happened. Like they wouldn't have been lauded for this behavior, but you do have to understand the rules of the game as it is actually played and not as you would have it be played, which is that if you expel these people, they, languish in obscurity and disappear from state politics. It's just not how it works. And people brought this up about Dylan Mulvaney as well, as like, oh, well, you're giving him more attention and more oxygen by hating on him so much. And it's like, I mean, at the end of the day, Pearson and Jones were already getting so much attention and being made into these like, beloved pets of the liberal left. Yeah. Dylan Mulvaney is going to be famous no matter what, because he's been, astroturfed into stardom by the sort of woke orthodoxy. So I don't know. I heard that argument come up a couple of times. Like, did they end up, making these people bigger? And it's like, I don't know. I think this story will go away. I don't think these people are actually going to like rise to being particularly important, prominent figures. At most, they would be like Stacey Abrams or Nina Turner, where it's kind of an astroturfed thing, and they never really.
Real quick question: is Nina Turner the one that
Ohio?
Brad Palumbo on Twitter is always like debate me? Or is that a different one?
It might be. I think
it's hilarious.
I had Brad on the show. I think he does go at it with Nina. I do recall that, as I recall. She's a state senator from Ohio that always is run. To her credit, she's at least ran for, kind of like Stacey Abrams, she always runs for statewide offices. She loses every time. She's lost like 3 times. So it's just like all these people that are held up. Beto O'Rourke is a slightly less ridiculous example because he actually was elected to Congress at one point. But And he very nearly did become a Democratic senator from Texas. So that was fairly impressive. But yeah, I just, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing.
Yeah.
Because,
and this Streisand effect is a natural part of the internet now. Like, it really is just kind of how this works. If you start, if we pick fights, it's going to draw more attention to them, and one side's going to get the attention maybe they wouldn't have gotten if the fight never existed. That's just kind of the environment we live in now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very much a lose-lose situation for Republicans. I would say you just kind of have to try and think a few steps ahead. I mean, again, I bring him up on the show a lot because I have a tendency to agree with him on most of these topics. Matt Walsh was saying, like, expel them again. like write a law that says that if they get expelled, they cannot be reappointed to the seat. Which, again, we're getting into kind of the wielding state power thing. It's sort of a nuclear option, if you will. But these days, I've always been pro-nuclear. I've always been like, fucking do it. Like, do what the left does. Go nuclear. If we bring a water pistol to a gunfight, I don't really see how that ends well. And I think that's kind of what happened in the Tennessee State House this past week, is that they brought a water pistol to a gunfight. They used existing legislative processes, not realizing the kind of media propaganda machine that they'd be going up against. That would give the Nashville City Council the cover to reappoint these people to their seats.
Just to get back to Justin Pearson real fast and his hilarious performance, one thing I will recommend to everybody is Jonathan Haidt, who was a co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, has written a ton of other things, very good thinker, founded Heterodox Academy. He wrote an article. It's been a few months now, but basically his theme is about the Tower of Babel and how social media has really, and a part of his theory is about how social media has become so corrupting because everything is a performance. This Justin Pearson character is a huge symptom of how everything is a performance, no matter how easy it is to see that it's a performance. Like, this is nowhere near authenticity. And I would just highly recommend John Haidt's writings about this to kind of give you a good theory of how the discourse is being corrupted by performance these days. Yeah,
well, and that's what I was also getting at when I said that a lot of people on the left probably see themselves in Justin Pearson. They say, well, he just does exactly what I do. I think a lot of these, I mean, how many, women do you know when you're in college or something that post the black square and put their fist up, and then you're talking to them and they're like casually dropping the N-word with a soft A into a conversation because there's a song on the radio that they like. I knew a lot of girls like this during the 2020 riots where I was like, I've heard them say the N-word. By the way, N-word, not a part of my vocabulary. It's really not. It's a bad word. I consider it a terrible word, but it just makes me laugh that there are these women that I knew. I hate to pick on women. I love women. I love, to quote Donald Trump, I love women. I really do. I've got my girlfriend sitting in the other room, but I pick on them because they were especially susceptible. And there were some men doing it as well, but the white women were especially susceptible to this thing during the George Floyd riots, where there were so many women that I had heard scream the N-word listening to rap music in high school or college, that overnight in June of 2020 started getting very, very serious about, structural racism and some things that they were reading on Twitter the day before, and hearing for the first time. And so that is that performance that you're talking about with social media, is that people play a character on social media. And, on this show, Ben and I try to give you a pretty authentic version of ourselves where, I put on a little bit of a radio announcer voice because this is a podcast, but, you get a pretty good look at who we are, and some shows you're going to get that. But even somebody like Matt Walsh kind of plays this curmudgeonly, late 30s, old curmudgeonly dad, father figure character. It's just what you're getting on social media. But on the left, it definitely reaches the point of absurdity to a much greater extent. And in a way that is, as we've said, just kind of hilarious past a certain point. I mean, there's nothing to do when you see the Justin Pearson thing, but laugh hysterically at how much it truly resembles something from like a Dave Chappelle skit. It is like really a Clayton Bigsby, not a Clayton Bigsby, but just some kind of Dave Chappelle sketch where some guy is engaging in what, and I'll leave it here before signing us off, what I've heard referred to as verbal blackface. And I think that's not a terrible way of putting it, because the way that Justin Pearson talked in 2016 would be described by many people as quote unquote white, as a white way to talk. And of course, going the route he's going with his political career. He wants to, quote unquote, talk more black. And that kind of is a condition that we find a lot of people being in, I think in large part also because of social media. And that's a conversation that will continue next time on the Veritas Podcast. We appreciate you all being with us this week. We will see you again in another couple of weeks. We have some new plans for the show coming up. We might get back into having some guests on the show or having debates and other things. Just so you know, there might be some programming changes. We'll still be the Veritas Podcast. Ben and I will be returning to see you soon in the next few weeks, but we'll be working on some new content. And I am working on more music, by the way. I appreciate all of you who have been listening to the music I put out on the channel. So thank you for being with us. If you're on iTunes, please give us a 5-star review and follow the podcast. If you are on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. Would love to hear what you thought of today's show. And I'll see you next time on the Veritas Podcast.